The festival was in full swing, and the city buzzed with excitement. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, and the air smelled of freshly baked goods, roasted nuts, and sweet candies. Crowds of people filled the streets, laughing, chatting, and enjoying the lively atmosphere. In the heart of the city, a large square had been transformed into a stage for one of the most anticipated events of the year, the Royal Guard's ceremonial parade. The Royal Guards were a symbol of pride and tradition, their polished boots clicking rhythmically against the cobblestones as they marched in perfect formation. Their uniforms, adorned with intricate gold embroidery and shiny metals, caught the sunlight, making them look almost otherworldly. But the real stars of the show were the horses. These magnificent creatures, towering yet graceful, moved with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Each horse had been carefully trained to perform precise maneuvers, showcasing not only their strength, but also their intelligence and bond with their riders. Among the spectators stood Claire, a woman in her early 30s who had spent most of the afternoon hopping between food stalls and pubs. She wasn't alone. Her friends had joined her earlier, but as the hours passed, they drifted away, leaving Claire to enjoy the festivities by herself. With each drink she consumed, her inhibitions slipped further away, replaced by a growing sense of confidence, or perhaps recklessness. Her cheeks flushed red, and her laughter grew louder, drawing amused glances from those around her. Claire wandered closer to the square where the Royal Guards were performing. A rope barrier separated the audience from the performance area, but it didn't seem like much of an obstacle to her clouded mind. The guards were putting on an impressive display, riding their horses in circles, standing upright in their saddles, and even crossing swords mid-gallop. The crowd erupted in applause after every trick, and Claire found herself clapping along, though her movements were clumsy and out of sync. Her attention soon shifted to one particular horse, a sleek black stallion named Shadow. His coat gleamed under the sun, and his dark eyes seemed to hold a quiet wisdom. Unlike some of the other horses, Shadow appeared calm and composed, almost regal in his demeanor. Claire watched him intently, mesmerized by his beauty and poise. When the guard riding Shadow dismounted briefly to speak with another officer, Claire's thoughts began to spiral. He looked so calm, she muttered to herself, her words slurred. I bet he wouldn't mind if I just sat on him for a second. The idea took root in her mind, fueled by alcohol and her inflated sense of daring. To Claire, it seemed harmless, a quick photo opportunity, maybe even a funny story to tell her friends later. She didn't consider the rules, the risks, or the fact that these horses were highly trained working animals, not props for entertainment. Ignoring the warning signs posted near the barriers, Claire stumbled forward, weaving through the crowd until she reached the edge of the restricted area. Bystanders noticed her approach and exchanged worried glances. Some called out, urging her to stop, but Claire brushed them off with a wave of her hand. Relax, she said with a giggle. I got this. What happened next would leave the entire square holding their breath and change Claire's life forever. Claire's focus was now entirely on Shadow, the black stallion standing patiently near the edge of the performance area. Her vision blurred slightly as she leaned against the rope barrier, her fingers brushing against the rough texture of the cord. The horse seemed so close, yet just out of reach. To Claire, it felt like fate, like Shadow was waiting for her to make her move. She glanced around, noticing the guards talking amongst themselves, their attention momentarily diverted from their horses. This is my chance, she whispered to herself, giggling softly. Without another thought, she lifted one leg over the barrier, ignoring the sharp protests from nearby onlookers. A young couple standing nearby exchanged worried looks before the man stepped forward, trying to intervene. Ma'am, you shouldn't do that, he said firmly but politely. These are trained animals. They're not meant for this. But Claire wasn't listening. In her mind, she was already envisioning herself atop Shadow, smiling triumphantly as her friends cheered her on in some imaginary scenario planning out in her head. Oh, come on, she replied dismissively, her voice loud enough to draw even more attention. I'm just gonna sit on him for a second. It's fine." With that, she hopped clumsily over the barrier and landed awkwardly on the other side, nearly losing her balance. The crowd gasped collectively, their murmurs growing louder as they realized what was happening. Parents pulled their children closer, while others whipped out their phones to capture the unfolding scene. Some shouted warnings, urging Claire to stop, but she ignored them all, fueled by a mix of bravado and impaired judgment. Her movements were slow and unsteady, each step exaggerated as if she were walking through thick mud rather than solid ground. As she approached Shadow, the horse turned his head slightly, his ears flicking back in mild curiosity, or perhaps suspicion. Claire reached out, patting his neck clumsily with an open palm. "Good boy," she slurred, her tone overly casual despite the tension radiating from everyone else around her. Shadow didn't react immediately, which Claire took as a sign of approval. Encouraged by his apparent calmness, she grabbed onto the saddle horn and began pulling herself upward. Her ascent was anything but graceful. One foot slipped off the stirrup as she tried to hoist herself up, causing her to sway dangerously. For a moment, it looked like she might fall backward, but she managed to cling tightly to the saddle, her knuckles white with effort. Shadow shifted beneath her weight, letting out a soft snort that carried an unmistakable note of unease. Claire mistook it for excitement, laughing nervously as she finally plopped down onto the saddle, her posture lopsided and unstable. By now, several guards had noticed the commotion and were rushing toward her. "Ma'am, please dismount immediately," one of them called out, his voice firm but controlled. But Claire either didn't hear him or chose to ignore him. Instead, she grinned widely, waving at the crowd like a queen addressing her subjects. "Look at me," she exclaimed, her words barely coherent. "I'm riding a royal horse." The situation was spiraling out of control, and the tension in the air was palpable. Shadow, normally a model of discipline, was beginning to show signs of agitation. His tail swished back and forth, and his muscles tensed beneath Claire's erratic movements. Yet Claire remained oblivious, completely unaware of the storm brewing underneath her, and the chaos that was about to erupt. Claire's triumphant grin faltered slightly as she realized just how high up she was. Perched awkwardly on Shadow's back, she swayed unsteadily, her hands gripping the saddle for dear life. The horse stood still beneath her, but his body language was changing in subtle ways that Claire failed to notice. His ears flicked back and forth, no longer relaxed but alert, catching every sound around him. His tail swished more forcefully now, a clear sign of growing discomfort. The guards were closing in, their boots pounding against the cobblestones as they called out again, louder this time. "Man, you need to get off the horse right now," one of them shouted, his tone firm yet edged with concern. But Claire wasn't listening, or perhaps she couldn't hear them over the roaring in her ears. Her confidence had turned into panic as she struggled to steady herself. She kicked her feet instinctively, trying to find balance, though her movements only made things worse. One of her flailing kicks accidentally brushed against Shadow's side, pressing lightly into his ribs. To anyone familiar with horses, it would have been an innocent mistake, a clumsy movement born out of drunken imbalance. But to Shadow, it felt like a command. Trained to respond to cues from his rider, he interpreted the pressure as a signal to move forward. With a sudden jolt, the stallion stepped ahead, catching Claire completely off guard. She let out a startled yelp, clutching the saddle even tighter as Shadow shifted beneath her. The crowd gasped audibly, some people covering their mouths in shock, while others instinctively backed away. Parents shielded their children's eyes, unsure of what might happen next. Claire's giggles faded into nervous laughter, then silence, as reality began to sink in. This wasn't fun anymore. It was terrifying. Shadow, sensing her unease, grew more unsettled. He took another step forward, his powerful muscles rippling under his glossy coat. Claire's erratic movements didn't help. She tugged at the reins without realizing it, pulling them too tightly. The leather bit pressed uncomfortably against Shadow's mouth, prompting him to toss his head sharply. Claire lurched forward, nearly sliding off the saddle entirely. She managed to catch herself, but her weight shifted awkwardly, throwing both her and the horse further off balance. The guards were almost within reach now, their faces tense with urgency. One of them stretched out his arm, trying to grab hold of Shadow's bridle. "Stay calm," he urged, directing his words toward both Claire and the horse. But calm was the last thing either of them felt. Shadow's agitation reached a tipping point when Claire inadvertently dug her heels into his sides again, this time harder than before. It was a reflexive action, meant to stabilize herself, but to Shadow, it felt like a sharp command to move faster. With a sudden surge of energy, the stallion reared up onto his hind legs, his front hooves slicing through the air. Claire screamed, her grip slipping as she clung desperately to the saddle. For a brief moment, she dangled precariously, her legs kicking wildly as gravity fought to pull her down. Then, with a violent buck, Shadow threw his body sideways, dislodging her completely. Claire flew backward, landing hard on the unforgiving cobblestones with a sickening thud. The square fell eerily silent, save for the sound of Claire groaning in pain. Shadow pranced nervously nearby, his nostrils flaring as he tried to make sense of the chaos he'd just endured. The guards rushed forward, their expressions a mix of relief and alarm. One of them quickly calmed Shadow, speaking softly to him while gently patting his neck. Another knelt beside Claire, assessing her condition as paramedics pushed through the stunned crowd, their medical kits in hand. What had started as a reckless act of bravado had spiraled into something far more serious, and there was no telling how badly Claire had been hurt. Shadow's reaction sent ripples of panic through the square, but the horse wasn't done yet. After tossing Claire off his back, he continued to move restlessly, his powerful hooves striking the ground with an unsettling rhythm. The once calm stallion now looked like a coiled spring, ready to explode at any moment. His eyes were wide, his ears pinned back, and his tail swished violently, as if trying to shake off the tension coursing through his body. The guards acted swiftly, their training kicking in as they surrounded Shadow to prevent further chaos. One of them stepped forward cautiously, holding out a steady hand while speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his tone calm but firm. "You're okay. You're safe." Shadow snorted loudly, his breath visible in the cool air, but he responded slightly to the guard's presence, lowering his head just enough to show he was listening. Still, his muscles remained taut, and his movements were jittery, betraying the stress he still felt. Meanwhile, Claire lay sprawled on the cobblestones, groaning softly as she tried to sit up, her face twisted in pain, and it was clear that something wasn't right. She clutched her side, wincing every time she moved even slightly. Bystanders whispered anxiously among themselves, torn between concern for her and awe at what had just unfolded. A few people knelt beside her, offering words of reassurance until paramedics arrived and took over. The medics worked quickly, assessing Claire's injuries with practiced efficiency. They gently examined her arms and legs, checking for fractures or sprains, before turning their attention to her torso. When they pressed lightly on her ribs, Claire cried out in pain, confirming their suspicions. She had likely suffered a broken bone or two. Her collarbone also appeared misaligned, its unnatural angle hinting at another injury. As they stabilized her, strapping her onto a stretcher to avoid further harm, Claire's expression shifted from shock to shame. Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality of the situation hit her full force. Back with Shadow, the guards continued their efforts to calm the agitated horse. Another handler joined them, bringing a bucket of water and a soft brush. He began grooming Shadow slowly, running the bristles along the horse's neck in long, rhythmic strokes. This simple act seemed to ease some of Shadow's anxiety, his breathing slowing down as he leaned into the touch. It was a reminder that despite his strength and discipline, he was still an animal capable of feeling fear, and tonight He'd been pushed far beyond his comfort zone. As the scene unfolded, whispers rippled through the crowd. Some people criticized Claire openly, calling her reckless and selfish for putting herself and others in danger. Others expressed sympathy, acknowledging that accidents can happen, especially when judgment is clouded by alcohol. Social media buzzed almost instantly, with videos of the incident spreading like wildfire. Comments ranged from outrage to mockery, with hashtags like #Horsegate trending within minutes. Through it all, Shadow stood quietly under the watchful eyes of his handlers, his earlier agitation replaced by a subdued weariness. The stallion's dignity remained intact, even after the ordeal. To those who knew him well, it came as no surprise. He was trained to handle pressure, but tonight had tested his limits. And while he couldn't speak, his actions spoke volumes. He'd reacted not out of malice, but out of instinct, defending himself against confusion and discomfort. By the time Claire was lifted into the ambulance, lights flashing and sirens blaring, the square had begun to empty. The festival atmosphere was gone, replaced by a somber mood. Parents ushered their children away, shaking their heads at the spectacle they'd witnessed. Guards packed up their equipment silently, their usual pride overshadowed by the evening's events. Shadow, now fully calmed, followed his handler back toward the stables, his head held high despite everything. For the Royal Guard, this was more than just an embarrassing incident. It was a stark reminder of the importance of respecting boundaries, both human and animal alike. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur for Claire, both physically and emotionally. Lying on the stretcher, she stared up at the ceiling of the vehicle, her mind racing as fast as her heart. The paramedics worked around her, their voices calm but urgent as they monitored her condition. Every bump in the road sent waves of pain through her body, forcing her to bite back tears. Her collarbone throbbed painfully, and even the slightest movement of her ribs made her wince. She could hear snippets of their conversation, words like fracture, concussion, and imaging, but none of it fully registered. All she could think about was how she'd ended up here. When they arrived at the hospital, Claire was rushed into the emergency room. Doctors and nurses surrounded her, asking questions about what had happened and whether she had any allergies or medical history. She answered in short, slurred sentences, her embarrassment growing with each word. The bright lights overhead and the sterile smell of the hospital only added to her discomfort. As they wheeled her into an examination room, she caught glimpses of other patients waiting nearby, some staring curiously at her. She wanted to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare, but there was no escaping the reality of her situation. X-rays revealed the extent of her injuries: a broken collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, and a mild concussion. The news came as a relief in some ways. It could have been much worse, but it also served as a harsh reminder of how reckless she'd been. A nurse helped her settle into a bed in the recovery area, explaining that she'd need plenty of rest and follow-up appointments to ensure proper healing. Claire nodded numbly, her thoughts drifting between guilt, regret, and fear of what might come next. Meanwhile, authorities arrived at the hospital to speak with her. 2 officers entered her room, their expressions neutral but serious. They introduced themselves and explained that they needed to understand exactly what had led to the incident. Claire hesitated at first, unsure of where to begin, but eventually she recounted the events of the evening: the drinks, the crowd, the horse, and her ill-fated decision to climb onto Shadow's back. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, her words heavy with remorse. "I wasn't thinking." The officers listened patiently, jotting down notes as she spoke. When she finished, one of them leaned forward slightly, his tone firm but not unkind. "Miss Claire," he said, "what you did was incredibly dangerous, not just for you, but for everyone involved. These horses are highly trained animals, and interfering with them puts yourself and others at risk." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "We're issuing you a formal warning today, but we hope this serves as a lesson moving forward. Respect boundaries, especially when it comes to working animals like these." Claire nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She felt humiliated, not just because of the accident itself, but because of the attention it had drawn. By now, videos of the incident had gone viral online, sparking debates across social media platforms. Some commenters mocked her, calling her irresponsible and selfish, while others expressed sympathy, acknowledging that mistakes happen. Friends and acquaintances messaged her, some offering support, others questioning her judgment. It was overwhelming, and Claire found herself wishing she could turn back time and undo everything. As the officers left her room, promising to stay in touch if further action was needed, Claire lay back against her pillow, exhausted. Her body ached, but the weight of her emotions was far heavier. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to cry freely, the tears washing away some of the shame and regret that had been building inside her. She knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, not just toward physical recovery, but toward understanding the consequences of her actions and making amends for the chaos she caused. Days turned into weeks as Claire began the slow process of healing, both physically and emotionally. Her injuries were painful but manageable with medication and rest, though the broken collarbone and cracked ribs made even simple tasks like dressing herself or turning over in bed a challenge. Every movement reminded her of that fateful night, and she often found herself replaying the incident in her mind, cringing at her own recklessness. The bruises on her body faded slowly, but the emotional scars ran deeper, lingering long after her physical wounds started to heal. As word of the incident spread beyond social media, it reached local news outlets, amplifying Claire's embarrassment. Reporters camped outside her house for days, hoping to get a statement from her. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, some expressing sympathy while others criticized her behavior. One tabloid even ran a headline calling her the woman who tried to tame Shadow, which only added to her humiliation. To escape the constant attention, Claire unplugged her phone, avoided online platforms, and spent most of her time alone, staring out the window or flipping through old photo albums to distract herself. But avoiding the world didn't make her guilt disappear. In fact, it grew heavier with each passing day. She couldn't stop thinking about Shadow, the majestic horse whose trust she had violated, and the royal guards who had worked so hard to keep their animals calm during the chaos she had caused. She replayed the scene in her head, Shadow rearing up, his powerful muscles tensing beneath her, the sound of her body hitting the cobblestones, the horrified gasps of the crowd. It haunted her dreams, leaving her restless and anxious. One evening, as she sat on the couch nursing a cup of tea, an idea struck her. What if she could apologize, not just to the authorities, but directly to the people and the horse involved? It wouldn't undo what had happened, but maybe it would help her take responsibility for her actions and show that she truly regretted what she'd done. The thought terrified her. Facing the guards again felt like walking back into the lion's den. But deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. The next morning, Claire mustered the courage to call the Royal Guard headquarters. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, and when a receptionist answered, she almost hung up. Instead, she forced herself to speak, explaining who she was and why she was calling. "I'd like to apologize," she said softly, her voice cracking. "To the guards, to Shadow, to everyone I upset that night." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the receptionist promised to pass along her request. To Claire's surprise, the guards agreed to meet with her. A few days later, she arrived at their training facility, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. The familiar sight of the horses brought tears to her eyes, and she had to take a moment to compose herself before being led into a small office. Two officers greeted her warmly, their expressions kinder than she expected. They listened intently as she poured out her apology, her voice breaking several times. "I never meant to hurt anyone, or anything," she said, "and I'm so sorry for putting Shadow in that position." To her relief, the guards accepted her apology graciously. "We understand that mistakes happen," one of them said gently. "What matters now is that you've taken responsibility for your actions. We appreciate your honesty and willingness to make amends." They then invited her to visit Shadow in the stables, a gesture that left Claire overwhelmed with gratitude. Standing face to face with the black stallion once more, Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. Shadow seemed calm, almost indifferent, as he munched on hay in his stall. With permission from the handlers, she reached out hesitantly, patting his neck softly. "I'm so sorry, big guy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Shadow flicked his ears toward her, acknowledging her presence without judgment. In that moment, Claire realized how much respect these animals deserved, and vowed never to forget it. Claire's apology to the royal guards and her heartfelt moment with Shadow marked a turning point in her life. Though she still carried the weight of her actions, she resolved to channel her regret into something meaningful. She couldn't undo the past, but she could use it as a catalyst for change, a way to grow and give back. After much thought, she decided to volunteer at a local animal sanctuary that cared for horses and other rescued animals. It was her way of making amends, not just to Shadow, but to all creatures who relied on humans to treat them with kindness and respect. Her first day at the sanctuary was overwhelming yet humbling. The staff greeted her warmly, unaware of her infamous encounter with Shadow, and assigned her simple tasks like grooming the horses and cleaning their stalls. At first, Claire struggled. Her injured collarbone made sweeping difficult, and her lack of experience with animals showed in her clumsy attempts to brush their coats. But the staff encouraged her, patiently teaching her how to handle the tools and approach the animals with care. "You'll get the hang of it," one of the caretakers assured her with a smile. "Just take your time." As weeks passed, Claire began to form bonds with the animals, especially the horses. There was Willow, a gentle mare with a white star on her forehead who had been rescued from neglect. Buddy, a playful gelding who loved to nuzzle visitors. And Storm, a spirited stallion who reminded her of Shadow. Each horse had its own personality, quirks, and history, and Claire found herself captivated by their stories. She learned about their needs, their body language, and the importance of building trust through patience and consistency. One particular breakthrough came when she worked with Storm. Initially wary of her, the stallion would flinch whenever she approached, his ears pinned back in suspicion. Claire didn't rush him. Instead, she stood quietly by his side, speaking softly and offering treats until he grew comfortable enough to let her touch his neck. Over time, Storm began to relax around her, even allowing her to lead him on short walks around the paddock. The sense of accomplishment Claire felt was indescribable. It wasn't just about earning his trust. It was about proving to herself that she could be responsible and compassionate. Through her work at the sanctuary, Claire gained a newfound appreciation for animals and the effort required to care for them. She realized how much she had underestimated horses like Shadow before the incident. They weren't props or symbols of grandeur. They were living, breathing beings with feelings, instincts, and vulnerabilities. Every snort, flick of an ear, or swish of a tail told a story, and Claire became adept at reading those subtle cues. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. The sanctuary staff praised her dedication, noting how far she'd come since her first awkward days. Visitors often commented on her warmth and knowledge, unaware of the personal journey that had brought her there. For the first time in months, Claire felt a sense of purpose and peace. She no longer cringed at the mention of the horse incident because she saw it as a pivotal moment that had set her on this path of growth and redemption. By embracing her mistake and using it to fuel positive change, Claire discovered a side of herself she hadn't known existed, someone capable of resilience, empathy, and hard work. And while she knew she'd never forget the chaos she'd caused that night, she also knew she was becoming the kind of person who deserved forgiveness, not just from others, but from herself.